a few months before I started dating Julie, actually just about a month, I had been invited to be a groomsman in a wedding of two friends. And the bride had begun to talk to me, again, for months, about one of her bridesmaids. And she told me one day, she said, "Listen, I dreamt about you and this bridesmaid of mine last night, and I can't wait for you to meet each other at our wedding." She was so excited. She showed me pictures. She described her. She was excited. She almost had us married off in her mind. And let me tell you something. When I got to the church for the rehearsal, and I walked in the back, and Kelly, the bride, came running up to me with this person and introduced me. She introduced us, and on the outside I was saying, "Hi, nice to meet you." And on the inside I was saying, "No. You are not for me, and I am not for you." There's no substitute for actually meeting a person. You know, even Skype doesn't take that place. Even a photo on a smartphone doesn't take that place. And many of us have that kind of relationship with God, that He's been described to us, and maybe we've heard about Him, maybe even read His Word, but we've never really met Him. Today, we're beginning a series on the book of Exodus, the second book in the Bible. And the theme of our series is Exodus, God reveals Himself. Now, all of the Bible is actually this same theme. It's about God showing Himself to humanity, who He is, what He's like, what pleases Him, His character, how He relates to us, and how we are to relate to Him. He is always the protagonist. He is always the main character. And the book of Exodus is crucial in this process of God revealing Himself. As the second book in the Bible, Exodus is a direct continuation of Genesis, the first book. This is not reflected in the NIV translation. But Exodus in Hebrew actually begins with the word "and." That is the first word. And the intent of that word is to tie it closely to what has come immediately before in Genesis. Genesis ends like this. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. And these are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family. That's the first verse of Exodus. So the two are very closely linked. In Genesis, God reveals Himself in creation and to certain individuals. And those are people that we normally refer to as patriarchs. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, to name a few. To Abraham, God specifically promised 4 things. Now, it's been a number of years since we looked closely at the life of Abraham, but I want to remind us of the 4 promises that God gave to Abraham. 4 promises. One was that God would give him a son. Another was that God would give him, or that through the son, God would make him into a great nation. Thirdly, that God would give him a land. And specifically that the nation, the people that were going to come from Abraham, they were going to have their own land. And fourthly, that all nations on earth were going to directly or indirectly be blessed through Abraham and his descendants. Those are the promises that God gave him. But to this point, beginning in the book of Exodus, 2 of those promises have been fulfilled. Abraham was given a son, and that son has become many. Lots of descendants. But this multiplying people group, though they may already be a nation, they don't have their own land. And as we pick up the account in Exodus, the children of Israel is what they're often called in the Bible. The children of Israel, this new nation, they're exiles. And they're living in a foreign land, the land of Egypt. And in this land of Egypt, though they've become very comfortable and their numbers have increased, they don't know their God. They know some things about Him, but they've not encountered Him. And now God is poised to reveal Himself to them as a nation. He's going to reveal His character and His love, His power, His control over all history, His discipline, and His plan. Over the next months, plural, my prayer is that all of us, every one of us, will be renewed and refreshed in our understanding and knowledge of God. Maybe some for the first time. Maybe others, as I said, to be renewed or refreshed through the eyes of the fledgling Israelite nation. And unlike my response upon meeting that girl, may our response be one of true awe and love, hearts and minds and bodies that say, "Yes, God, we are yours." I'll be reading the first chapter of Exodus. You are welcome to follow along or just listen. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now, Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Then, a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard labor and brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, "When you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, if it's a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live." The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" The midwives answered Pharaoh, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They're vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive." So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: "Every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." In this first chapter of Exodus, as the scene is being set for one of the most remarkable events of history, God reveals himself as a God who is present in absence. Okay, I know that is a contradiction. So to make it more accessible to us, maybe we can say that God is a God who is present even in apparent absence. When do we usually doubt that God is present? Is it in joy and peace and success when things are all going really well? Not usually. Generally, it's in sadness and failure and need and suffering. That's when we question the presence and the activity of God. Julie and I have a number of friends who either lost their homes or whose homes were severely damaged over this last week in the Houston area during the flooding and the hurricane there, Hurricane Harvey. And I wasn't there, I wasn't present, but I can only imagine that there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people that were standing there watching the water levels rise, and were praying, and we're saying, God, you're the God of all nature, you're the God of all history, you have all power. Can't you see what's happening? Can't you make the floodwater stop? Can't you keep the water just 2 inches from our door? I wasn't there, but I can only imagine that people questioned as the water rose into their home, as some had to be evacuated under emergency circumstances. Where is God? Why is God not seeing and acting to prevent this suffering and this loss? Do you think perhaps that the Jewish people were wondering where God was and what on earth He was doing in this situation? Now, let's back up for a moment and remember why the Israelites are even in Egypt in the first place. Scholars are not certain on this point, but estimates are that as a people, Israel has now been in Egypt for around 300 to 400 years. Could be a little bit more, could be a little bit less, but that's kind of the target that we're looking at. Joseph, the first member of this Israelite clan to go to Egypt, he ended up there because his brothers sold him as a slave. And the slave traders took him to Egypt and then sold him to an Egyptian. You may remember the story how Joseph miraculously went from being incarcerated in an Egyptian prison to being second in command over the entire country in just one day. And God used Joseph to save the nation of Egypt from famine. Now that famine was covering the whole region. It was covering the area and the land that Joseph called home, where his family and his father and his brothers were. And most of you know this story. Eventually, Joseph's brothers make their way down to Egypt looking for food, trying to buy food to sustain their families and keep them alive. There in Egypt, they encounter Joseph, their long-lost brother, and eventually the entire clan moves to Egypt. All of Jacob, and Jacob, his name was changed to Israel. Maybe you recall that. That's why they're called the children of Israel. So all the Israelites moved down there, according to this opening passage here in Exodus, about 70 of them. That's been hundreds of years ago now. When they moved, Pharaoh, the king at the time, out of honor and deference to Joseph, because after all it was Joseph who had saved everybody with his ideas of storing up the grain for the years of famine, he honors these people by giving them the land of Goshen and saying, settle here, treat this as your home. And they've become wealthy and comfortable and prosperous. But now, history is taking a drastic turn in the opposite direction. Hundreds of years have passed, and the text says a new Pharaoh has come to power, a new king who apparently has ignored the history of his people, or else he simply doesn't care. Who's Joseph to him? I don't care who this Joseph is. The Israelites are not to be honored, but rather they're now seen either as a threat or as a source of free labor. And Pharaoh makes 3 distinct attempts to control and oppress the population of the Jews, right? First, by making them slaves. He looks around and says, man, these people are becoming a threat. They're filling this nation. And incidentally, the word used, the Hebrew word, when they're talking about how they filled the land, that word is swarmed. They swarmed. They were multiplying exponentially. They were all over. They were filling every corner of Goshen, and they were filling every part of Egypt. And they were growing and growing and growing. And Pharaoh looks at them and says, these people are a threat, so we are going to make them slaves. And we're going to literally work them to death. We're going to work them to death, and we're going to work them so hard that procreation is going to be the last thing on their minds. It's going to be the last thing that their bodies are going to be able to do. And we are going to literally work them to death as a nation. Didn't work. In fact, what was the response? What does it say? They increased even more. Even more. So then Pharaoh says, okay, I've got to take a more direct approach. Approach 1 was work them to death. Approach 2 is I'm going to kill all of their male babies. I'm going to have the Hebrew midwives do it for me. And we just read the story, he calls them in, says, here's your instructions, kill every boy baby. He tried that. The midwives refused, and what does the text say specifically? After each one of these, again, they increased even more. And then Pharaoh says to his people now, he's not talking to the Hebrews anymore, now he's talking to his people, says he commands his people, listen to this, folks, every Jewish boy, he authorizes his people, you see a Jewish boy, you throw him in the Nile River. Do you think that the children of Israel might have questioned God's presence? They might have questioned his activity on their behalf. Where is God in this mess? Well, one way that we see his presence is that no matter what Pharaoh does, their numbers keep multiplying exponentially. That's a distinct sign of God's blessing on his people. Now, we know that beginning in the next chapter, in chapter 2, God is going to start raising up a leader, a deliverer, who will eventually lead all the Israelite population out of Egypt into their own land, eventually. But those that were living in chapter 1 of Exodus, they didn't know that. And they were groaning under this very real suffering. But God was still present. And God was still active. And what about you? What about us? None of us may be physical slaves right now. But I'm guessing that there are a number of us who are oppressed in one way or another. I know that some of us are suffering very deeply for a variety of reasons. I know that many are in very challenging financial straits. There are family problems. There are some that are enslaved to sin and addictions. Where is God in all of this? Where is God in your life? You may ask that very same question. God, why are you silent? Why are you far? Why are you not acting? What we see in this passage is that God, even when he seems silent or distant, he's still at work on behalf of those who belong to him. They couldn't see it. They didn't know what was going on behind the scenes. And because of their suffering, they may not have even been able to notice that the way they were multiplying was a sign that God was still with them and that he was still blessing them. God is revealing himself as a God who is present, even in apparent absence. If you belong to him, you may not see his work. You might not feel his presence as you would like to. But that doesn't mean he's not active and he's not present. And that's a call for faith again. To trust that God is present and to trust that he's active, even if what's visible to you right now in your limited vision doesn't seem to bear that out. There's another way that God reveals himself here in chapter 1 of Exodus, and he reveals himself as a God of life. So actually, here's a question. I will take responses from the floor, okay? What was the first command that God ever gave to humanity? Oh, Larissa. Okay, here's the deal. I'm going to let you answer because in the first, what did you say in the first service? In the first service, you said the first command given to humanity was to not eat from the tree that was in the middle of the Garden of Eden. Friends, this is why you should come to 2 services. Because if you get it wrong in the first service, you get it in the second. All right, Larissa, so what was the first command? Be prosperous and fill the earth. Yes. Multiply and fill the earth. Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Friends, that is the first command that God ever gave to humanity. And it's in the context of blessing. God's talking to Adam and Eve, and he says, and God blessed them and said, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it. That's the first command. Now, some of you might say, whoa, wait. But that was before sin. That was before sin came into the world. And after sin came into the world, we don't want to hear any more of this multiplication stuff because human beings are terrible. But this command is repeated after the flood. God says to Noah and his family, the same command, multiply, fill the earth. The principle here is that God has made humanity, God has made mankind in his image. And so his joy and his blessing to the earth is the multiplication of his image on earth. Okay? So in Egypt, Israel's been obeying that command. And obeying it quite well, as we see. And God has then blessed them by multiplication because that command is both a command and a blessing. From creation, children, family, and fruitfulness are God's command as well as his signs of blessing and faithfulness. And now here comes this new Pharaoh. And he chooses to set himself up in direct opposition to God. He may not have realized that. But that's exactly what he was doing. God's command was to be fruitful and multiply. Pharaoh says, oppress the people, control their population, kill their babies. Does that sound familiar? Oppress the people, control the population, kill the babies. Does that sound familiar? Because God says, multiply my image on earth. And humanity says, the problem is we have too much image of God on earth. And we need to control the population of the image of God. Because the image of God is the problem. In Exodus 1, we see God's heart for life. We see God's heart for children, and we see God's heart for family. In spite of all Pharaoh's attempts, God continues to give life. And it's worth noting how God rewards the midwives for their protection of life. Have you seen this? Did you notice that? So apparently the midwives were single women. And again, we have to understand the context in the ancient Near East, in North Africa, in antiquity. Children, offspring, family was definitely a sign of blessing. It was something that people wanted and longed for. And these two women, single women apparently, who were constantly around family and birth and new life, didn't have families of their own. And the text specifically says that because they honored God and they honored God's heart for life, God honored them how? By giving them families of their own. By giving them children of their own. They were faithful to preserve and protect life. Now, just briefly here, I want us to consider if, as a culture, as a people, we have unwittingly, perhaps, moved closer to Pharaoh's camp than to God's. Because our society is so often against life, against children, against families. And children are often thought of more in a context of expense and burden and inhibition than in the context of blessing and replication of the image of God and discipleship. This is intentional. It's not accidental. I was in the mall a couple years ago in Marketplace Mall. I was just walking down. I looked in one of the windows, the display windows for one of the clothing stores, and there was a t-shirt there on display, "Make sex, not babies." And I know that few, if any of you, would advocate in favor of the practice of abortion, but I want us to go further than that. When it comes to the ability that God has given you in your body to create new life in the context of marriage, how have you viewed that power? Do you see it as something that is a gift from God, that belongs ultimately to Him? Do you see it as a sign of His favor in your life, that He's the one who told humanity to multiply? Married couples, let me ask you this. Have you given your fertility to God? Have you even asked Him? Have you even consulted Him about the timing and number of your children? I know many of you have. I'm just asking this as a general question. If you haven't noticed it, God has blessed Calvary International Church. And there are lots of little God image bearers in this place. Many, many, many. And it seems like there are always more. Thank you, God, for that blessing. But do you view, and I'm talking about a heart situation right now. I'm not talking about how we act outwardly, but inwardly, whether they're your children or other children, do you view them as an annoyance or an inconvenience? I want to get at our heart attitudes. Is that how we view children? Because sometimes you'll hear them loudly praising God the only way they can in the nursery. Babies cry for a lot of reasons. And that's really the only way they have of expressing much emotion. So, hunger, pain, discomfort, tiredness, worship. I don't know. It's all the same. Who knows? They're praising God however they can. But how do you view children? Even here in the service, babies, when they're crying or grizzling or something like that, and does that make you irritated? Or do we say, wow, God, Thank you for another image bearer that you've given to your church, that you've given to your family. At the church that I served at in the United States, we had a family who had 9 kids. Great family. Good friends of ours. And at one point, we were doing I was youth pastor there, and I don't remember what it was. We were doing some kind of youth activity that cost money. And another woman came into the church office and said, look, I would like to help, some kids, someone from the youth group that wants to participate in this but doesn't have the money. I want to give a scholarship. I'd like to help out. And actually the woman who received her there at the church office said, well, this family, they have several kids going, and, I'm sure they could use the help. And the woman who was offering to pay looked at her and said, you know what? They've made their own bed. They've made their own decisions. They knew it was coming. They can deal with the consequences. I want to pay for somebody else. But that's something worth asking ourselves, friends. It's easy to condemn other people, but I want us to ask us that. What is your first thought when you see a couple with a lot of children? Is it negative? Is it critical? Is it saying, what were they thinking? Or someone needs to teach them the facts of life? I think they've figured out the facts of life pretty well. But it's a question we have to ask. Or is our attitude, wow, God, thank you for this example of this family who has chosen to allow you to use their bodies, use their family, use their home to replicate your image. Thank you, Lord. Amen. And let me help them and support them any way that I can. When you see children, let's be honest, when you see children running around this sanctuary or the patio, and they're under your feet, and you almost trip and fall over, and they scream right behind you way too loud, and it makes you jump, and they're pounding on the drums after the service, and another one is trying to play the piano, and someone else has knocked over the guitar, and they're doing something there, and all these things, and they're crawling under the pews and cleaning the floor with their shirts, and all that kind of thing, this craziness. What is your heart attitude toward children? Now, friends, I'm not advocating, I'm not saying, hey, we give children the run of this place, they can do whatever they want, they can be destructive, they can be out of control. That's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. That is not what I'm advocating for. What I am suggesting is, though, what is our heart attitude toward the blessings that God has given in life? In life, these midwives He blessed by giving them children of their own. His people who were suffering, He blessed by multiplying their numbers and giving them new life. In John 10:10, and you say, whoa, wait a second. We're in the second book of the Old Testament, and now you want to jump over into the New Testament? Whoa, that's not fair. Slow down. It is fair. Let me give you a little preview. All of Exodus is pointing to Jesus Christ. All of Exodus is pointing to Jesus Christ. And for the Jewish nation, the Exodus was the most marking historical event. For the Christian church, the cross is our Exodus. The cross is our Exodus. The death and resurrection of Jesus Christ that gives us new life, that sets us free from the bondage of sin and death. That's our Exodus. So when I'm jumping ahead to John 10, I'm only going where Exodus is pointing us. But listen to what Jesus says in John 10. He said, the thief, this is Jesus talking, he said, the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come that they might have life, and they might have it to the full. God is a God of full life. And Jesus is the author of that life. God Himself is the author. So I'm going to take a little rabbit trail here. In college, I studied literature. That was my degree. I love literature, I love reading. But there are certain things that I don't understand still. And I remember particularly being in junior high and high school and studying poetry. And there were some poems that are just incredible. There are others that we would read, and the teacher would spend days talking about this poem and about all the hidden meanings and how the poet did this and this angle and that angle. And I remember sitting there thinking, did the author really mean that? Duda, can we get an example put up there, please? This is just to say, as a poem by William Carlos Williams. I read this in high school, and I remember staring at the page like, you got to be kidding me. This got published? Go ahead. I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. That's a published poem. We spent an entire day of class on that poem when I was in high school. And to this day, I am convinced that William Carlos Williams woke up in the morning, his wife was still asleep, he went to the fridge, he saw the plums, he knew he shouldn't eat them, he ate them anyway, and he snuck out of the house before his wife got up and left her an apology note on the fridge, and somehow it got published. And he's become a famous poet because of it. But I remember in that high school class sitting there and saying, I wish William Carlos Williams were here right now. And I want to ask him, come on, man, tell me the truth. What really happened with this poem? What does it really mean? My teacher, who also happened to be my sister at the time, she spent a whole 45 minutes delving into the hidden meaning behind this, and I don't think there is one. Come on, William, tell me the truth. What's the point of this? There is a point. I want to talk to the author. I want to find out what the poet really meant. And when we talk about life in all of its grandeur and all of its depth and all of its meaning, God is the author of life. He conceived of it. He invented it. He gives it. He is in favor of it. And if we want or need to understand what that means, we can go to him, the author. We're not going to understand it in any other way. No other philosophy, no other teacher, no other brain is going to be able to give us the meaning and intent of life like the author did. And the author of life says, that's why I came. That's why I came to earth. To give full life, to give abundant life. But the first part of that verse also talks about the enemy, doesn't it? We have an enemy, the thief, who is anti-life because he hates God and he hates God's image, and he comes to steal, kill, and destroy life. Now, as we bring this together, I want you to engage your imagination and imagine that you are living in Egypt in Exodus chapter 1. For the sake of imagination and for the sake of the example, you are neither Egyptian nor Hebrew. And you have the privilege of objectivity, of standing back and looking at these two forces that are at work. And you get to choose with whom you will ally yourself. Will you ally yourself with Pharaoh? Or will you ally yourself with the children of Israel? Now let's think about that logically. Over here we have Pharaoh who has all the power. He's got the title, the position, the army, the wealth, the land, the influence. And over here we have a large group, granted, but a group of oppressed slave nation. And see, this situation, Pharaoh seems to have all the advantage. But we know, don't we? See, we have this incredible gift of looking back at history, and we know how this conflict's going to end. We know who's going to win that confrontation between Pharaoh and God, and it's going to be a resounding victory. And I want us to fast forward that image and that choice here into the 21st century, into 2017, and we consider how are you going to ally yourself? With whom are you going to ally yourself? Are you going to be on the side of the spirit of the age? That's how the Bible refers to the power of the system of the world, which has set itself up against God and rebellion against him. Because friends, right now, that spirit seems to have all the power. That spirit seems to have all the influence. And you know what? It hasn't hit us too hard here yet, but the church is going to get squeezed more and more and more and more by the world. And we've seen this happening. This is not news to any of us, or at least it shouldn't be, that tremendous pressure is being exerted on the church to become just like the world. And to say that Pharaoh is right, whether it's questions of sexual ethics, whether it's questions of gender, whether it's questions of the view of life in general, and we are being pressured and pressured and pressured. And I don't think it's going to get better. And even as the children of Israel were getting pressured more and more and more and more and more, where was God? God was still operating and working for them. And we can look back in history and see how that battle turned out, but we can look forward in history because of the promises of God, and we know how this battle is going to end up too. And the challenge is, friends, ally yourself with God. Ally yourself with the God of history, with the God of life, not with the spirit of the age. The spirit of the age feels strong right now. It feels powerful and it looks very, very attractive. But the doom of the spirit of this age is already written. And the victory of God has already been established. I know it's hard to remember that when we live in conflict and difficulty. As I said earlier, Exodus is pointing forward to Jesus Christ. And there's a song, you can put that up there, Duda. It's just a title, My Deliverer by Rich Mullins. I challenge you to, I don't challenge, it's not a challenge, it's an invitation. Go to YouTube, type in My Deliverer, and listen to this by Rich Mullins. In this song, Rich Mullins he's singing about Jesus Christ, the great deliverer. But as he does that, he also looks back to the children of Israel, and he says, this is what those people must have sung back then in the desert along the banks of the Nile. My deliverer is coming. My deliverer is standing by. God was raising up a deliverer for the children of Israel. God has raised up his Son, Jesus Christ, to be the deliverer of all nations for all time, those who will ally themselves with him. So the question is, with whom will you ally yourself? With Pharaoh or with God? Today, we get to celebrate communion, the table of the Lord. And this is an incredible blessing. It's such a gift. It's a very real physical way that God demonstrates his pro-lifeness. That he has offered, that he shows us, that we reenact the sacrifice of Jesus, his death and resurrection, that gives us life. That's why the bread is his body and the juice is his blood. And that we physically take those into our bodies, and as we eat them and drink them physically, we are spiritually fed by the presence of Jesus, his life in us. There's no more powerful symbol that God has given his church of new life than communion. So as those who will be serving come forward to prepare the table, I offer you a few moments just to be in silence, to reflect, to prepare your heart for this joyful but solemn remembrance of the life of Christ given for his church.